Good evening, I'm David Kramer with Alaska Weather. As always, please visit our website, weather.gov/Alaska. You can check out any updates to the forecast that we have, or watches, warnings, or advisories that we might have out for your area. Also call our weather info line, 1-800-472-0391. Get any updates to our forecast through that means as well. And you can email me at the address at the bottom of the screen, david.kramer@noaa.gov. Taking a look now at the watches, warnings, advisories that we have out for the state, we'll start off to the west at St. Lawrence Island, where we have a winter storm warning out for snow. That is going to be in effect until 10 a.m. on Saturday morning, and there are going to see snow amounts of 5 to 7 inches, with the highest amounts on St. Lawrence Island. As we move up the coastline, we also have a winter storm warning out for the Point Hope area, way up there in the kind of northwestern portion of the state. That is going to be out until 7 p.m. this evening on Friday evening. And that is going to be for additional snow amounts of 2 to 4 inches. Now, as we move into the southwestern portions of the Brooks Range, we do have another winter storm warning out for snow as well. That is going to be in effect until 4 p.m. on Saturday, and that's going to be for 5 to 8 inches of snow. And then as we get towards the Ambler area, this is going to be for areas north of Ambler, so starting to get back into the Brooks Range. And we do have a winter storm warning out for snow as well. This is going to be out until midnight on Saturday night, so snowing throughout the day could lead to snow amounts of 8 to 12 inches. Then as we move to the eastern portions of the Brooks Range, we have some winter weather advisories out. Both of these are for snow as well. And both of these are going to have snow amounts from 4 to 7 inches. And there is potential as we get down onto the North Slope area that we could have a mix of freezing rain as well with that snow. So be mindful of that in those areas. And these are out until midnight Saturday night. As we look way down to the south in the Kenai Peninsula area, on that western side of the Kenai Peninsula by the Anchor River, we also have a flood watch that is in effect specifically for the Anchor River. That is going to be in effect through this evening, and there is potential for some ice jam flooding in the area on the Anchor River. Taking a look now at our satellite imagery, we can see a low pressure system that's moving up into the Bering Sea, and as we watch this loop again, we can see the frontal system attached to this low that's moving through the eastern Aleutians into the Alaska Peninsula towards the west coast of the state, bringing a lot of cloud cover to the area. Out over the Gulf, we have some high pressure out. We can see some ridging out there as some of the clouds are starting to spill over the ridging over mainland Alaska. And we can watch some of the lower cloud cover out over the Panhandle area starting to clear up in the afternoon, trying to break way to some nicer sky conditions and fairer weather for the Panhandle area. Taking a look now at our weather for the remainder of the day, we can see that high pressure out over the Gulf, extending that ridging in over the Panhandle area, and some over the south central area as well, leading to some areas of fog out over the Cook Inlet area. Some isolated rain showers for southern portions of the Kenai Peninsula down by Kodiak Island as well. But as we move further to the north, we can see that southerly flow from that low pressure system out to the west, with the frontal system pushing into the Alaska Peninsula, bringing up a long fetch of warmer air and moisture to the Aleutians and to mainland Alaska, especially the western side, bringing that rain up through southwest Alaska into places of the interior where, with the colder surface temps, where we're still seeing some areas with snow, we are expecting some fog to linger through with this rain as well. However, further to the north and out west, we are going to see the transition back to the snow for St. Lawrence Island, through much of the Seward Peninsula, into the Brooks Range, and a lot of places along the Arctic coastline as well. Back down with the main low itself by the western Aleutians, we do have rain throughout much of the Bering, Aleutian Islands, and some rain for the Pribilof Islands as well. As we move into tonight, the low itself is going to stay primarily in the same position. However, the front is going to continue to push to the north, continuing to bring that fetch of warmer air from the south, bringing rain to much of the Aleutian Islands and the Alaska Peninsula throughout much of the Bering and southwestern portions of the coastline. However, on the backside of this low, we do have some of the northerly winds coming back and bringing some of the colder air back to the western Aleutians. A mix of rain and snow is expected there. However, for mainland Alaska, southerly flow is going to be the dominating force, with rain throughout much of the mainland, some spottier showers for south central Alaska, with some of the higher elevations in the Talkeetna Mountains Alaska Range still going to be primarily snow, but the mix of rain and fog going to be continued throughout the interior down into the Norton Sound area, and we are going to continue to see mix of rain and snow for Seward Peninsula up into the Kotzebue Sound area as well, primarily snow for the Brooks Range and Arctic coastline, and then down in the Panhandle area, that high pressure sitting out over the Gulf, continuing to allow some nicer conditions for the Panhandle. As we move into Saturday with the high pressure holding firm out over the Gulf of Alaska, extending that region into south central Alaska, still expecting to see the panhandle with some fairer weather. And that's going to extend now into south central Alaska, keeping a lot of the precipitation further to the north and to the west. As we do move up into northern portions of the state, we can see that we still have that southerly flow out over southwest Alaska that's going to bring continued rain and snow to the interior, with some areas of snow further north in the Brooks Range and Arctic coastline. But with the main bulk of the southerly flow out over southwest Alaska, we do expect that to be warm enough to be rain down the YK Delta area into Bristol Bay and into the Alaska Peninsula. Out with the main low pressure system, we see some rain for the Pribilof Islands, for the central and eastern Aleutians, but we still have some of the northerly flow on the western side of the low pressure system pulling down some of that colder air from the north, bringing the mix of rain and snow to the western Aleutians. As we look into Sunday, that low is still going to remain in relatively the same spot, still bringing in some of the colder air from the north, mix of rain and snow for the western Aleutians, but we have a new system approaching the central Aleutians from the North Pacific, bringing another round of warmer air and rain to the islands. Much of the rest of the Bering Sea and Aleutians are going to be some spotty showers and some lighter precipitation as we move into the Alaska Peninsula, and another low coming up towards Kodiak Island area, bringing some more showers to the area. And we will still see some rain throughout southwest Alaska and some lighter areas of rain for south central. The other low out over the western portion of the state is going to be the separation between our warmer temps to the south and some of the colder conditions starting to make their way back into the interior, with the mix of rain and snow expected out towards the Norton Sound area, and then some snow for the Kotzebue Sound area out through northern portions of the interior and through much of the Brooks Range. Down in southeast, we are still going to have high pressure out, especially over the eastern portions of the Gulf, keeping much of the precipitation at bay, continuing through Sunday as well, with just some isolated showers out over the Gulf waters. As you look at our temperatures, low temps starting for Saturday morning will stay down in southeast Alaska. We have temperatures dropping down into the mid-30s for most locations. However, we do have Ketchikan and Sitka staying a little bit warmer at 40 degrees, Yakutat down to 34 degrees. In south central Alaska, temperatures dropping down in interior locations into the mid to upper 30s. Along the coastline, right around 40 degrees, with Seward and Kodiak are staying down only at 40 degrees. Glen Allen dropping a little bit lower, 29 degrees expected low. As we move up into the interior portion of the state, we can see the mid-30s for most locations, and that's going to extend through the interior down into southwest Alaska as well, where we have similar conditions for much of southwest Alaska, down into the Bristol Bay area. A little bit warmer, King Salmon, 41 degrees expected low for Saturday morning. As we look in the YK Delta area along the coastline, it's going to be a little bit colder, where we will have temperatures dropping down to right around freezing. That's going to extend through the Seward Peninsula area and Kotzebue Sound. But as we get up into the Brooks Range and further to the north, quite a bit cooler. Some areas up along the most northern portions of the state are going to drop below zero, as cold as Utqiagvik at minus 6 degrees Saturday morning. Moving all the way down to the Alaska Peninsula, temperatures dropping to the mid to upper 30s, and that's going to be true for the Aleutian Islands and in the Pribilof Islands as well. Saturday afternoon for the Pribilof Islands, getting back up to around 40 degrees. Lower to mid 40s for much of the Aleutian Islands and Alaska Peninsula. Right around 50 degrees for areas around Bristol Bay. A little bit colder as we move up to the north into the mid 40s, and that's going to extend into much of the interior again. A little bit colder as we get further to the north, and as we get along the coastline, a little bit colder conditions there as well. Only getting into the upper 30s for much of the west coast. And as we move up to the Seward Peninsula area, mid to lower 30s, and that's going to be true in Kotzebue Sound area as well. Up along the Arctic coastline, temperatures getting up into the teens for the most northern locations, into the 20s, so we get a little bit closer towards the Brooks Range. And then as we drop down into south central Alaska, temperatures getting up into the mid to upper 40s. A little bit warmer there for Valdez, 54 degrees expected high. And then down in the Panhandle area, getting up into the lower to mid 50s. As we move to Sunday morning, temperatures dropping down to the mid to upper 30s for the Panhandle area. Mid to upper 30s for much of south central as well. Some places along the water staying a little bit warmer. In the interior, expecting temperatures to drop down to the mid 30s. That's going to be true for southwest Alaska as well. As we move up further to the north along the Arctic coastline, right around 0 degrees is expected. In the 20s for the Kotzebue Sound area, and right around freezing for the Norton Sound area. Down in the Alaska Peninsula, mid to upper 30s is expected, and that's going to be true for the Aleutian Islands and Pribilof Islands. So look into Sunday afternoon, staying out west, getting up into the 40s for the Aleutians and Pribilofs, and then into right around 50 degrees for southwest Alaska. Mid 40s as we get further to the north, extending into the interior as well. Seward Peninsula getting up into the mid 30s. And then along the Arctic coastline, we have temperatures getting up above zero, with some locations getting into the teens. Warmer there as we get further off to the west. Down in south central Alaska, getting into the mid 40s, with some of the more eastern locations getting into the mid 50s. And then down in the Panhandle area, mid to upper 50s for most locations, warmest as we get further to the south.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
For aviation, we'll start off with a look at our flying weather on Saturday morning. Out over the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands, widespread IFR conditions are expected. A mix of MVFR and IFR along much of the west coast of the state, with more IFR as we get into the YK Delta and areas further to the north. In the Arctic coastline, we do have IFR conditions expected, and MVFR throughout much of the interior, with a mix of MVFR and IFR for south central Alaska, and primarily IFR down in the Panhandle. Saturday afternoon, much of the Panhandle clearing up to be marginal conditions, with some of those IFR conditions lingering along the Gulf of Alaska. In the south central area, VFR conditions for eastern locations, MVFR as we get further to the west. It's a mix of MVFR and VFR as we get into the interior portions of the state, and then still primarily IFR as we get into the Brooks Range and further to the north, with some areas by AKwx seeing some VFR conditions. Down the west coast, a mix of IFR and MVFR conditions are expected, and a mix of MVFR and IFR expected for the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands. Moving into Sunday morning, mix of MVFR and IFR continuing for the Bering and Aleutians, but up along the west coast of the state, IFR conditions are expected. That's going to diminish as we move further inland, where we're seeing some VFR conditions making their way into interior portions of the state and along the Arctic coastline. Down in south central, a mix of VFR to IFR conditions, VFR out east, IFR as we get by the Cook Inlet area. And then down in the Panhandle, primarily IFR conditions. However, as we get up by Haines and Skagway areas, we are going to see some more VFR conditions. Sunday afternoon, still primarily MVFR for the Panhandle, with some IFR conditions lingering, especially as we get closer towards the Gulf of Alaska. Along the North Gulf Coast, we're going to have continued IFR conditions, but a mix of VFR and MVFR for the rest of South Central. In the interior, VFR conditions out east getting marginally worse as we move further to the west until we get to IFR conditions for the western interior and along much of the west coast. Up along the Arctic coastline, primarily VFR, but some isolated areas of MVFR are expected. Then a mix of MVFR and IFR for the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands. Taking a look at our passes, starting up North AKwx Pass should be IFR throughout the day on Saturday, as well as Adigan Pass. Lake Clark and Merrill will both be MVFR throughout the day. However, on the eastern side, we are expecting some IFR conditions. Rainy Pass should also be MVFR throughout the day, but again, on the east side, we are expecting some IFR conditions. Windy Pass expecting to be marginal throughout the day. Isabel will start off marginal and then improve to VFR in the afternoon. Mentasta Pass will be VFR throughout the day Saturday. Tanita Pass will start off IFR, then improve to marginal conditions later in the day, as well as at Portage, starting off IFR, improving to marginal conditions. And Chilkoot and White will both start off in VFR and then improve to VFR conditions in the afternoon. Taking a look at our freezing levels, we do have quite a bit of warmer air moving in over the Gulf of Alaska, pushing into interior portions of the state, with the 8,000 foot freezing height moving through the Panhandle area and through the southern portions of south central Alaska, with the 2,000 and 4,000 foot levels moving up all the way up to the Brooks Range. Surface freezing line moving out through the northern part of the Bering Sea, and then way out east through much of the area along the Panhandle. As we look out for icing on Saturday, much of mainland Alaska is going to have icing, and central and southern locations we are expecting above 7,000 to 8,000 feet. But as we get north of the Brooks Range, we are expecting the icing conditions to be below 5,000 feet. Then out over the Bering and Aleutian Islands, above 8,000 feet is expected. Taking a look at our jet, strongest core of the jet moves over the west coast at southerly direction, 95 knots, and then changes directions out over our ridging, becoming westerly over the Arctic coastline at 130 knots. Looking at 9,000 feet, similar flow with our winds moving around our ridging with that high centered over the northern part of the Gulf of Alaska. We have southerly flow over much of the western part of the state, getting up to as high as 45 knots over the YK Delta area, becoming westerly out over much of mainland Alaska and up along the Arctic coastline, 35 to 40 knots for most locations, some places up to as high as 45. So you move down to 3,000 feet. Again, similar flow, those southerly winds over much of the west coast and southwesterly winds over the Aleutian Islands area, 30 to 35 knots in most locations. Some areas in the western part of the interior getting up to as high as 40 knots, diminishing along the Arctic coastline and much of south central, with some weaker winds over the panhandle out of a northerly direction around 25 knots. Then way out west, as we move by the western Aleutian Islands around our Bering Low, we do have northerly winds around 40 knots expected there. Looking at our turbulence, quite a few areas that we are expecting some moderate turbulence. Western Aleutians below 3,000 feet. Eastern Aleutians into the Alaska Peninsula above 4,000 feet. Then Bristol Bay area up through the western and central portions of the interior below 5,000 feet is expected. Then up by the Point Hope area below 3,000 feet is expected.
What we're looking at is a legacy of the Ice Age. Permafrost and methane is a time machine. So what we're going to do is walk back in time. We're going to see old carbon, old bones, old environments, and none of those are in equilibrium with today's climate, so that's the problem. That world doesn't exist anymore, and it hasn't for 10,000 years. It was nicely and very delicately separated from this modern warmer climate by about this much moss. And when that moss goes away, whether for fire or for human disturbance or for warming, then all hell breaks loose.
Permafrost. It's maybe the part of the cryosphere that's most out of sight and mind. It's fascinating how it formed in the first place and how it got loaded with so much carbon. In a minute, we'll go back underground with Matthew Sturm from the University of Alaska Fairbanks. But first, let's meet Peter Griffith, NASA's project manager for the Above campaign, which supports more than 70 science projects studying forest and tundra vegetation, wildfires, animals like birds, caribou, and Dall sheep, methane emissions from expanding northern lakes, and the impacts of climate change on people in Alaska, Canada, and around the world. Many of those projects have some direct connection to permafrost.
Permafrost is the hidden cryosphere. It's the permanently frozen soil that surrounds the Arctic, all across Alaska, northern Canada, and then across Eurasia. The ground has been frozen during the ice ages.
During the ice ages, there was not enough snowfall in the drier regions of Alaska and Canada to form glaciers there, so the land was suitable for vegetation.
What happened is that over thousands and thousands of years, all of that plant material got compacted and frozen every winter and buried and pushed down, so that today there's 300 feet deep of frozen water and dead plants and some pieces of dead animals too. Sometimes you find woolly mammoths in the permafrost. But most of it, of the organic matter as we call it in the permafrost, is frozen plant material.
Some of that plant material is now thawing and decaying, releasing its ancient carbon into the atmosphere, sometimes in the form of methane gas bubbling out of expanding northern lakes.
We started this field campaign because the Arctic is the part of the planet that is warming first and fastest. And there are consequences to this for permafrost. So during the Arctic Boreal Vulnerability Experiment, we're studying permafrost with people on the ground, from aircraft flying over the region, and also from satellites in space.
Another way to understand the permafrost is to take a walk below ground with Matthew Sturm and into the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers permafrost tunnel.
And they've dug this tunnel back into the side of a hill about 200 feet, and it goes sort of sloping down so that by the end of the tunnel you're about 100 feet underground, and you're surrounded by bones sticking out of the wall from the steppe bison and the mastodons that are frozen in it. There's sticks that are 40,000 years old, that you can touch with your hand. There's grass that's still green, that's tens of thousands of years old because it got frozen, right away, and it's never lost the green color.
But as fascinating as it is to see these relics of an ancient era, or to see a tree split in half by thawing soil, or even to light a ball of methane on fire from under winter ice, at the end of the day, Peter and his colleagues want to know just how much organic matter is frozen in that permafrost, and how fast it might be released.
Currently, we think that there is something on the order of 2 to 3 times as much carbon locked up as frozen organic matter in permafrost as there is carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So releasing all of that organic carbon from permafrost into the atmosphere would be a real game changer. That would be a tremendous transformation of the planet's atmosphere. Now, the good news is that it would take a very, very long time for that to happen. However, we are warming the planet at a rate now that calls into question how quickly is that changing and what the consequences in the near future and in the far future are going to be.
You're in the middle of a field somewhere in California at 4 in the morning. It's sort of surreal in a way because you've put so much time into it for so long, and actually seeing it over there is like, whoa, it's a big deal.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
For marine, we'll start off with a look at our ice edge. We do still have some ice lingering in the Bristol Bay area and along much of the west coast. However, with the south and eventually easterly winds, we are going to see that shift off more to the north and to the west. As you look now in southeast Alaska for Saturday, in the inside waters, we have northwesterly winds 10 knots. As we get more up to the north in the Lynn Canal area, we do have southerly winds around 10 knots. Out over the Gulf, northwest winds 15 knots are expected with seas around 5 feet. Then on Sunday, out over the Gulf waters, calming down a little bit, east to northwest or west to northwest winds around 10 knots, seas as high as 9 feet. And then in the inside waters, southerly winds 10 to 15 knots. Out over south central Alaska, in much of the Gulf, westerly winds 10 to 15 knots. However, as we get closer towards the Barren Islands, becoming more easterly, around 15 knots on both sides of the Barrens. And then as we move up into Cook Inlet, northeasterly winds 10 to 15 knots there. And in Prince William Sound, westerly winds around 10 knots. Continuing with the weaker winds for Sunday, so look at Prince William Sound, easterly winds 10 knots are expected. Variable winds around 10 knots in northern portions of the Gulf, becoming easterly 15 as we get closer towards the Barren Islands. And then on the western side of the Barren Islands, easterly winds 20 knots. Northeast winds 10 knots through Cook Inlet. Seas as high as 5 feet out over the Gulf. For Saturday, for the Alaska Peninsula and Kodiak Island, starting by Kodiak Island, southeast to east winds around 15 knots. Then getting a little bit stronger, 15 to 20 knots out of a south-southeast direction for much of the peninsula. Seas as high as 13 feet, highest on the Pacific side. Then on Sunday, weaker flow here, 10 to 15 knots out of a southeasterly direction around the peninsula, and then easterly to southeasterly winds around Kodiak Island, 15 knots there. Seas as high as 10 feet, highest again on the Pacific side. As you look out over the Aleutian Islands on Saturday, southerly winds for the central and eastern Aleutians, 20 to 25 knots are expected. Seas highest on the Pacific side, getting up to as high as 15 feet. As you move out by the western Aleutians, becoming northwesterly, 35 knots with seas as high as 16 feet. Then on Sunday, continuing to be gale force winds out by the western Aleutians, westerly winds 35 knots expected with seas up to 11 feet, dropping down to 25 knots as we get closer towards the central Aleutians. And then somewhat variable winds 10 to 15 knots, becoming more southeasterly by the eastern Aleutian Islands. Along the west coast of the state, primarily a south to southeasterly wind direction, 15 to 20 knots at all locations, seas as high as 8 feet for St. Matthew Island and by the Pribilof Islands. Then on Sunday, continuing to be somewhat south-southeasterly wind for most locations, 10 to 15 knots, getting up to as high as 25 knots by St. Lawrence Island out of a primarily easterly direction. Along the Arctic coastline, we have winds out of a northerly direction, 10 to 15 knots for eastern locations, becoming westerly around 15 by AKwx, and then down the west coast, northeasterly winds, 25 to 35 knots, strongest by the Capes, and then down by the Bering Strait area, becoming southerly, 15 knots. For Sunday, starting up along the Arctic coastline, west to northwest winds 10 to 15 knots down the west coast of the state, northeasterly winds 20 knots getting up as high as 30 knots by the Capes, and then down by the Bering Strait area, switching from northerly to easterly around 25 knots is expected. For the remainder of the night, we do have frontal system pushing into the Seward Peninsula area, bringing up a strong or long fetch of warm and moist air from the south, bringing rain to areas throughout the Bering Sea, Aleutian Islands, Alaska Peninsula, southwest Alaska, and starting to push some of that moisture further to the north. However, still primarily snow for St. Lawrence Island, where we do have a winter storm warning out for snow. And we do have some other winter storm warnings for areas around southwestern portions of the Brooks Range, and then some winter weather advisories for snow in the eastern portions of the Brooks Range. Check our weather.gov/Alaska website for additional details for any of those areas. Continuing on with the forecast, we have some snow up along the Arctic coastline, rain and fog mix for much of the interior out by the Norton Sound area as well, and then some isolated areas of primarily rain showers at lower elevations in south central Alaska, but as we get into the Talkeetna Mountains and Alaska Range, primarily snow. Then down in the Panhandle area, high pressure dominating the area, keeping fair weather for the Panhandle. Saturday is going to be continued fair weather for the Panhandle area with high pressure remaining out over the Gulf of Alaska. It's high pressure extending out over South Central, going to keep a lot of precipitation out of South Central as well. However, we're going to have lingering rain showers from the southerly flow out over the Bristol Bay area and other places around Southwest and for the Alaska Peninsula, where our frontal system draped over much of the interior part of the state, keeping a mix of rain and snow for much of the interior, but transitioning over to snow for more northern locations in the Brooks Range and up along the Arctic coastline. Alaska Weather, I'm David Kramer.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.